My name is Lillian Hart. I'm 30 years old, a journalist, or at least I used to be. These days, I mostly write obituaries for a small-town newspaper. Not exactly the hard-hitting career I'd imagined, but after everything that happened, I suppose I should just be grateful to have a job at all. I've always believed that the truth matters. That's why I became a reporter in the first place. But some truths are like shattered glass. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. And once they cut you, they leave scars that never really fade. The train rattled beneath me, its steady rhythm almost soothing. Almost. I pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching the countryside blur into streaks of green and gold. I was going home, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The last time I was on this train, I was 18, running away from a life that suffocated me, from a family that never saw me as anything more than an afterthought. 12 years later, here I was, dragged back by a single phone call. Your father's will is being read tomorrow. Be there. My sister's voice had been ice cold, the same way it always was when she spoke to me. No warmth, no grief, just command. As if I owed her something, as if I owed any of them anything. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the edge of my seat. The man across the aisle glanced at me, his eyes lingering a little too long. I looked away. I was used to that, people staring, wondering what was wrong with me. The quiet one, the strange one, the daughter no one talked about. The train lurched, and my bag slipped from the seat beside me, spilling its contents onto the floor. A book, a half-empty water bottle, and a photograph. I froze. It was an old picture, faded at the edges. My father stood in the center, stern and unreadable as always. Beside him, my sister, Evelyn, flawless, poised, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. And then there was me, tucked at the edge of the frame, my expression caught somewhere between resignation and defiance. I remembered that day, my 16th birthday, the last one I ever celebrated with them. I shoved the photo back into my bag, my chest tight. I didn't need memories. Not now. Not when I was walking back into a house full of ghosts. The train whistle blew, sharp and sudden. My stop was next, somewhere in the distance. Thunder rumbled. A storm was coming. And so was I. The train shuddered to a stop, jerking me back to the present. The platform outside was nearly empty, just a few scattered travelers hurrying through the drizzle that had begun to fall. I stood slowly, my legs stiff from hours of sitting, and slung my bag over my shoulder. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if I were carrying more than just my few belongings. Stepping onto the platform, the first thing that hit me was the smell, damp earth and something faintly metallic. It hadn't changed. 12 years gone, and this place still smelled exactly the same. The familiarity of its scent, an unexpected pang through my chest. I hadn't realized I'd remembered. The station was smaller than I recalled. The paint on the benches, more chipped. The once bright signage now faded. Time had worn at everything here, just as it had worn at my memories. I walked slowly toward the exit, my boots clicking against the wet concrete, each step taking me closer to a past I'd sworn I'd left behind. Outside, the rain had intensified. I hesitated under the station's awning, watching the water sheet down in curtains. A black town car idled at the curb, the driver standing beside it with an umbrella. He didn't look at me, didn't gesture, just waited. Of course Evelyn would send a car. She'd want to control every detail, right down to my arrival. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain. The water soaked through my coat almost immediately, cold fingers tracing down my spine. The driver finally looked up as I approached, his expression carefully blank. "Miss Hart?" he asked, though we both knew who I was. I nodded, and he opened the rear door without another word. The leather seats were cool against my skin as I slid inside, the scent of polish and something faintly floral filling the space. The door closed with a solid thunk, sealing me in silence as the driver took his place behind the wheel. Through the rain-streaked windows, the town passed by in smudges of color and light. The bakery on the corner where I'd stolen my first kiss with Tommy Riley. The park where Evelyn had pushed me off the swings when I was 7. breaking my wrist. The library where I'd hidden for hours after school, desperate to avoid going home. Every landmark carried memories, some sharp as broken glass, others dulled by time. The car turned onto the long, tree-lined drive that led to Hart House. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag as the familiar iron gates came into view, still bearing the family crest, a stag with a crown of thorns. The gates stood open, as if waiting for me. As if they'd known I'd come back eventually. The house appeared through the trees, all gray stone and sharp angles, its windows dark despite the gloom of the afternoon. It looked exactly as it had the day I left, imposing, unwelcoming, a monument to the Hart family's wealth and influence. The kind of house that didn't feel like a home, but like a museum where children were meant to be seen and not heard. The car came to a stop at the front steps. Before the driver could move, I opened my own door and stepped out into the rain again. Let Evelyn have her little power plays. I wasn't a scared teenager anymore. The front door opened before I could knock. Mrs. Peabody, our housekeeper since before I was born, stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Lillian," she said, her voice as crisp as the starched apron she always wore. "You're late." I almost laughed. Of course that would be my welcome. Not "we missed you" or "I'm sorry for your loss." Just an admonishment for my tardiness. Some things never changed. The train was delayed, I said, stepping past her into the foyer. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wood polish and the faintest hint of my father's pipe tobacco, though he'd been gone for weeks now. The smell made my throat tighten unexpectedly. Mrs. Peabody closed the door behind me with a quiet click. "Your sister is waiting in the study," she said, taking my dripping coat without meeting my eyes. "The reading of the will begins in 20 minutes. I nodded, running a hand through my damp hair. "And mother?" A pause, just a fraction of a second. But I caught it. "Mrs. Hart is resting in her room. She's not well enough to join us. Not well enough, or not willing." I wondered, but I didn't ask. Some questions were better left unanswered. The sound of heels clicking against marble pulled my attention to the staircase. Evelyn stood halfway down, one perfectly manicured hand resting on the banister. She hadn't changed much in 12 years. Still tall and willowy, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless despite the hour. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The pearls at her throat, the same ones our grandmother had left her when we were children. "Lillian," she said, her voice cool, "you look well." The pause before well spoke volumes. I knew what she saw: my second-hand clothes, my unpolished nails, the dark circles under my eyes from too many sleepless nights. "The black sheep come home at last." "You look the same," I replied, which wasn't entirely a compliment. Evelyn's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. She descended the remaining stairs with the grace of a queen approaching her subject. "The others are already gathered. We've been waiting for you." "Then let's not keep them waiting any longer," I said, and walked past her toward the study. The room was just as I remembered: dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the massive mahogany desk where my father had spent most of his days. The air smelled of leather and whiskey, the lingering traces of a man who was no longer here. Around the room, the assembled relatives sat in stiff silence. Uncle Richard with his perpetual scowl, Aunt Marjorie clutching her handkerchief like a lifeline, Cousin Gregory looking bored already. All the usual suspects gathered like vultures waiting to pick at the carcass of my father's estate. At the front of the room, a man I didn't recognize, presumably the lawyer, stood shuffling papers. He looked up as I entered, his expression professionally neutral. "Oh, Miss Hart, we can begin now that you're here." Evelyn swept past me to take the seat closest to the desk, the place of honor. I remained standing near the door, suddenly unsure where I belonged in this tableau of family and fortune. The lawyer cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today to execute the last will and testament of Charles William Hart, deceased." As he began to read, my gaze drifted to the portrait above the fireplace: my father in his prime, stern and unyielding, his cold blue eyes seeming to follow me even now. I wondered what he would think of me standing here, the prodigal daughter, returned. If he'd even noticed I was gone. The lawyer's voice droned on, listing bequests to servants, donations to charities, the usual formalities. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her back straight, already the picture of the grieving heiress. I could see the anticipation in the set of her shoulders. She knew what was coming. The bulk of the estate would go to her, of course. The golden child. The perfect heart. And to my daughter, Evelyn Murray Hart, I leave the summer house in the Hamptons and a yearly stipend of. I stopped listening. It didn't matter. I hadn't come back for money or property. I'd come because some small, foolish part of me had needed to see this through, to finally close this chapter of my life. The lawyer's voice changed, sharpened. I tuned back in, and to my daughter, Lillian Grace Hart, every head in the room swiveled toward me. Evelyn went very still. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including Hart House, the family, investments, and controlling interest in Hart Industries. The silence that followed was absolute. Then chaos erupted. Evelyn shot to her feet. That's impossible. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. There must be some mistake. The lawyer didn't flinch. There is no mistake, Miss Hart. Your father was quite clear. Aunt Marjorie gasped. Uncle Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. Cousin Gregory actually looked interested for once, and Evelyn. Evelyn turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, raw, unfiltered hatred. What did you do? She whispered, the words barely audible over the rising din of protests. I could only stare, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. My father had left me everything? It made no sense. He'd barely acknowledged my existence when I lived here. Why would he? The lawyer raised his voice over the commotion. There is one more provision. He waited until the room quieted. In order to inherit, Lillian must reside at Hart House for a period of no less than 6 months. If this condition is not met, the estate will be divided equally among the remaining family members. 6 months. In this house, with these people. Evelyn's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental had shifted. The game had changed. The pieces were moving in ways none of us had anticipated. And for the first time in 12 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The study erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against hardwood as relatives surged to their feet, voices overlapping in indignant protest. Aunt Marjorie's handkerchief fluttered to the ground as she clutched her pearls, while Uncle Richard's face darkened to an alarming shade of purple. Only Cousin Gregory remained seated, watching the scene unfold with newfound interest, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Evelyn stood perfectly still amidst the uproar, her manicured nails digging into the leather chair back. The tendons in her neck stood out like piano wires as she addressed the lawyer through clenched teeth. I demand to see the original document. This has to be some kind of error. The lawyer remained impassive, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. I assure you, Miss Hart, the will has been thoroughly authenticated. Your father amended it 6 months ago with 2 witnesses present. He produced a second envelope from his briefcase. He also left this personal letter for Lillian. All eyes turned to me. The weight of their collective gaze pressed against my skin like a physical force. My fingers trembled as I reached for the envelope, the crisp paper cool against my fingertips. The familiar scrawl of my father's handwriting stared back at me, just my name. Nothing more. Evelyn moved before I could react. In one fluid motion, she snatched the letter from my grasp. If there's been some misunderstanding, that's enough. The lawyer's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He held out his hand. The letter is legally part of the estate distribution. Unless you'd like to explain to probate court why you interfered with its delivery. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. 4. Evelyn's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths before she finally thrust the letter back at me, her eyes burning with barely contained fury. This isn't over, she whispered. The words meant for my ears alone. I waited until she'd stormed from the study before turning to the lawyer. I'd like some privacy, please, the relatives protested, but the lawyer ushered them out with professional efficiency. When the door clicked shut behind them, the sudden silence rang in my ears. The study smelled of leather and lemon oil, just as it had when I'd been summoned here as a child to receive some punishment or another. Only now, I stood behind my father's desk rather than trembling before it, The envelope tore easily beneath my fingers. A single sheet of heavy stationery slid into my palm, covered in my father's distinctive handwriting. The sight of it sent an unexpected pang through my chest. Lillian, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've learned by now what I've done. Before you refuse the inheritance, and I know that stubborn streak of yours will make you want to hear me out. The truth is, I've known for years that Evelyn wasn't mine. Your mother confessed the affair when Evelyn was 3, after the hospital discovered my blood type made paternity impossible. I stayed for appearances, but I could never look at her the same way again. When she pushed you down those stairs when you were 14, yes, I knew it was deliberate. I realized the kind of person she was becoming. You asked me once why I was so hard on you. It's because you were the only child I could claim as my own. The only one worthy of carrying on the Hart name. I drove you away trying to make you stronger. And for that, I'll always regret. The letter ended abruptly, the final sentence trailing off into nothingness. I turned the page over, searching for more, but the back was blank. My hands shook as I lowered the paper, the words swimming before my eyes. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. I barely had time to shove the letter into my pocket before the door flew open. Evelyn stood framed in the doorway, her composure restored but her eyes glittering with something dangerous. Well, she demanded, what did it say? I met her gaze evenly. That's between me and father. Her laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Still playing the loyal daughter. Even now? She stepped further into the room, her heels sinking into the Persian rug. You can't seriously believe you're going to waltz back in here after 12 years and take everything that's rightfully mine. According to the will, it's rightfully mine. I kept my voice calm even as my pulse hammered in my throat. But we both know you're not going to accept that without a fight. Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes. Clever girl. You always were smarter than you looked. She moved to the bookshelf, trailing her fingers along the spines. Tell me, Lillian, do you really think you can handle running Hart Industries, managing the estates? Or are you just planning to sell everything off and disappear again? I hadn't thought that far ahead. The enormity of what I'd inherited settled over me like a lead. Wait. Hart Industries employed thousands. The family's various properties spanned 3 countries. And I was expected to live in this mausoleum of a house for 6 months to claim it all. I'll manage, I said. Evelyn plucked a leather-bound volume from the shelf of first edition Dickens that had been in our family for generations. You won't last a week, she said, flipping through the pages with deliberate casualness. This house has a way of wearing people down, especially those who don't belong here. The unspoken thread hung between us. I remembered all too well how Evelyn had made my childhood a living hell. The accidental shoves down the stairs, the ruined school projects, the whispered rumors she'd spread at school. And that was before I'd discovered her greatest betrayal, the one that had finally driven me away. I belong here more than you ever did, I said softly, and we both know why. Something flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Fear. Guilt? Before her mask slipped back into place, she snapped the book shut with a sharp crack. We'll see about that. Turning on her heel, she paused at the doorway. Dinner's at 7. Don't be late. Again? The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone with the ghosts of my past and the crushing weight of my unexpected future. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, the storm mirroring the tempest brewing within these walls. I crossed to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. The ground stretched out before me, the manicured hedges, the stone fountain, the path leading down to the lake where I'd spent so many hours hiding as a child. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. My fingers found the letter in my pocket. All these years, I'd believed my father's coldness meant he didn't care. But the truth was far more complicated. He'd cared too much, in all the wrong ways. And now I was trapped in this gilded cage for 6 months, with Evelyn as my jailer and a fortune as my reward. A movement caught my eye, a figure standing by the lake, barely visible through the driving rain. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakable even after all these years. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel, the groundskeeper's son, my first love. The boy who'd promised to wait for me, the man who'd broken my heart. He stood motionless in the rain, staring up at the house as if he could sense my presence. Then, As suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and disappeared into the storm. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging the glass. The past wasn't done with me yet, and if I was going to survive the next 6 months, I'd need to confront all of it, the betrayals, the secrets, and especially the truth about why I'd really left Hart House 12 years ago. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, its deep tones vibrating through my bones. 6 o'clock. 1 hour until dinner. 1 hour until my next battle with Evelyn. I squared my shoulders and turned away from the window. The game was afoot, and for the first time in my life, I held all the cards. Now I just had to learn how to play them. The grandfather clock's chime still echoed through the study as I made my way upstairs, each step on the familiar creaking staircase sending a jolt through my body. My old bedroom waited at the end of the east wing hallway, or at least, what had been my bedroom before I left. 12 years was more than enough time for Evelyn to have claimed it as her own sitting room or closet space, but when I pushed open the door, the breath left my lungs in a rush. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The same pale blue wallpaper with its faint floral pattern. The same white wrought iron bed frame, though the duvet had been changed from my childhood lavender to a more mature navy. The bookshelf still held my dog-eared paperbacks, arranged in the same haphazard order. Even the faint stain on the carpet from where I'd spilled nail polish at 16 remained, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who knew where to look. The only change was the layer of dust covering every surface. Undisturbed for years, I stepped inside, my fingers trailing across the dresser, leaving streaks in the dust. The mirror above it reflected a woman I barely recognized, dark circles under my eyes, hair still damp from the rain, the sharp angles of my face more pronounced than they'd been at 18. The girl who had slept in this room would hardly know me now. A knock at the door startled me. Mrs. Peabody stood in the hallway, her hands folded primly in front of her. "Your mother would like to see you before dinner." My stomach twisted. I'd been avoiding this moment since arriving. "Is she?" "Her good days are fewer than her bad," Mrs. Peabody said, her voice carefully neutral. "But she's lucid today." For now, I followed her down the hall to the master suite, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the faint sound of classical music. Chopin, my mother's favorite. Mrs. Peabody stepped aside. "I'll send up your dinner tray if you'd prefer to eat here after," a kindness I hadn't expected. I nodded my thanks and pushed the door open. The room smelled of medicine and lavender, the heavy drapes partially drawn against the storm. My mother sat by the window in her wheelchair, a cashmere shawl draped over her thin shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. The stroke had left its mark. The left side of her face sagged slightly, and her once lustrous auburn hair had gone steel gray and thin. But when she turned to me, her hazel eyes, so like my own, were sharp and clear. "Lillian." Her voice wavered only slightly. "You came." I stood frozen in the doorway, 12 years of unsaid words clogging my throat. The last time I'd seen her, we'd screamed terrible things at each other. Now she looked so fragile, so human. "You knew about the will," I said finally. It wasn't a question. She sighed, her fingers plucking at the shawl. "Charles told me when he changed it. We fought, of course." A faint, bitter smile. "Some things never change." I stepped further into the room, my eyes catching on the framed photos covering her dressing table. Evelyn's graduation. Evelyn's debutante ball. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. Only one showed me a stiff family portrait from when I was about 10, standing slightly apart from the others. "You never told me," I said softly, "about Evelyn." My mother's hand stilled. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows and the faint piano sonata from the record player. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked at last. I thought of all the times Evelyn had tormented me, all the times my mother had taken her side, the final terrible fight that had driven me away. "It might have." The wheelchair creaked as she turned to face me fully. "You think knowing she wasn't your father's would have made her cruelty easier to bear?" She shook her head. "No, it would only have made you a target sooner." The words hit like a physical blow. All those years, my mother had known the truth. had watched Evelyn torture me, had let me believe I was the problem, the unwanted child, the difficult one. Why didn't you stop her? My voice cracked. All those times I tried, my mother interrupted, in my way. But Charles, he couldn't stand the sight of her after he found out. And Evelyn knew it. She took that anger out on you because she couldn't take it out on him. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the eaves of the old house. And you? I asked. Did you hate me too? Her eyes filled with tears. Oh, Lillian, never. But I failed you. I failed both of you. She reached out a trembling hand. Can you forgive me? I stared at her outstretched fingers, remembering all the times I'd ached for her comfort as a child. Now the offer came too late after the damage was done. After I'd built a life without her, before I could answer, a crash came from downstairs, followed by raised voices. My mother's face paled. Evelyn, I was already moving toward the door. Stay here. The commotion came from the dining room. I arrived to find Evelyn standing over a shattered crystal vase, her chest heaving, while Mrs. Peabody knelt to gather the pieces. Replace every damn thing in this house. Evelyn was shouting. It's mine. It was always supposed to be mine. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wild. You, the word was a venomous hiss. This is your fault. I stepped around the broken glass. Having a tantrum won't change the will, Evelyn. Her laugh was shrill. Oh, I don't need to change the will. I just need to wait you out. She stepped closer, her perfume cloying. 6 months in this house? You'll never last. You'll run away again. Just like you did before. The dig hit its mark. But I refused to flinch. I'm not 18 anymore, no? She agreed. You're just the same pathetic girl who couldn't handle the truth. Her gaze flicked to the doorway behind me. Ask Daniel about that. If you dare. My blood ran cold. What does Daniel have to do with anything? Evelyn's smile was all teeth. Why don't you find out? She brushed past me, pausing to whisper, dinner's cancelled, by the way. I've lost my appetite. I stood frozen long after she'd swept from the room, her words echoing in my mind. Mrs. Peabody stood with a handful of glass shards, her expression grim. Daniel comes by every Thursday to tend the gardens, she said quietly. Tomorrow's Thursday. The unspoken invitation hung between us. I looked down at the broken crystal scattered across the floor, each fragment reflecting the chandelier's light in jagged, distorted pieces. Like my family, like my past, like the truth I'd run from 12 years ago. I knelt to help gather the glass. What time does he usually arrive? Mrs. Peabody met my eyes. Dawn. I nodded, pressing a sharp piece of glass into my palm until it bit. The pain grounded me, kept me from splintering apart right there on the dining room floor. Tomorrow, I would see Daniel again. Tomorrow, I would finally get answers. And tomorrow, I would decide once and for all whether Hart House with all its ghosts and secrets was worth fighting for. The first light of dawn was just creeping over the horizon when I slipped out the kitchen door, the crisp morning air biting at my exposed skin. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning in my childhood bed as memories and unanswered questions swirled through my mind. Now, with the house still silent around me, I made my way toward the gardens, my boots leaving faint impressions in the dew-covered grass. The grounds were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant call of a mourning dove and the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. The rose garden had always been Daniel's domain. Even as teenagers, I'd find him there at dawn, pruning shears in hand, lost in his work. Part of me wondered if he still kept the same habits after all these years. I rounded the corner of the hedge maze and stopped dead in my tracks. There he was. Daniel stood with his back to me, his broad shoulders straining against the faded flannel shirt he wore. His dark hair was longer than it had been when we were young, curling slightly at the nape of his neck where the morning mist had dampened it. Even from this distance, I could see the familiar way he tilted his head when concentrating, the careful precision of his movements as he examined a climbing rose. My throat tightened. 12 years. 12 years since I'd seen him, since that terrible fight in the rain when he'd called me a coward for running away. 12 years since I'd loved him, I must have made some small sound, because suddenly he went very still. Then, slowly, he turned. Time seemed to stop as our eyes met. His face had changed sharper angles, a faint scar cutting through one eyebrow, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. But his eyes were exactly as I remembered, that impossible shade of green, like sunlight through leaves. Lillian. My name on his lips sent an electric current down my spine. He didn't sound surprised. I wondered if you'd come. The words were carefully neutral, giving nothing away. I forced myself to breathe, to speak. Mrs. Peabody said you'd be here. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Still getting information from the staff, I see. He turned back to the rose bush, running a thumb over a cluster of thorns. Some things never change. The tension between us was palpable, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stepped closer, the scent of damp earth and roses filling my nose. Daniel, about what happened, don't. His voice was rough. Not unless you're ready to tell me the truth this time. I flinched. The truth, that was the heart of it, wasn't it? The reason I'd left without explanation, without looking back. The secret that had haunted me for 12 years. The garden seemed to close in around us as I searched for the right words. Evelyn mentioned you yesterday, I said instead. She made it sound like you knew something. Daniel's hand stilled on the rose stems. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. She told me, Lillian, the day after you left. Came down to the cottage all smiles, so pleased with herself. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. She told me you'd been sleeping with your professor to get better grades. That he'd threatened to expose you unless you left town quietly. The world tilted around me. Of all the vicious rumors Evelyn had spread about me over the years, this was one I hadn't heard. And you believed her? For the first time, emotion flickered across Daniel's face. I didn't want to, but you were gone. No note, no call, just gone. His jaw tightened. And then your father paid me to leave town too. Said it would be best for everyone if I started fresh somewhere else. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. My father paid you off. $10,000 and a job reference. A bitter laugh escaped him. Took the money too. My dad's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. I reached out without thinking, my fingers brushing his arm. He tensed but didn't pull away. Daniel, none of that was true. About the professor, any of it. Evelyn lied. Then why did you leave? The raw pain in his voice made my chest ache. We had plans, Lillian. We were supposed to. I know what we were supposed to do. The memory rose unbidden. Our secret meetings by the lake. The maps spread out on his bedroom floor. The bus tickets we'd bought with painstakingly saved money. We'd been going to leave together. Start fresh somewhere no one knew us as the groundskeeper's son and the troubled Hart daughter. But then everything had changed. I found something, I said softly, the night before we were supposed to leave. Something that changed everything. Daniel's eyes searched mine. What could possibly? A twig snapped behind us. We both turned to see Evelyn standing at the garden entrance, a smug smile playing about her lips. She wore a silk dressing gown, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Am I interrupting? She purred. Daniel's posture went rigid. Miss Hart. Evelyn's smile widened at the formal address. Daniel, how lovely to see you again. Her gaze slid to me. And Lillian, up before dawn? My, you never were much of a morning person. I stepped between them, my pulse roaring in my ears. What do you want, Evelyn? She feigned innocence. Can't a sister check on her dear sibling? Especially one with such a complicated history with the help. Her eyes glittered with malice. Though I suppose you've already told Daniel the real reason you left, haven't you? Daniel's voice was dangerously calm. She was just about to. Evelyn's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Oh, then by all means, don't let me stop you. She made a show of settling onto a nearby stone bench. This should be good. The weight of their combined gazes pressed down on me. I could feel the moment slipping away, the truth clawing its way up my throat after 12 years of silence. I found the letters, I said quietly. Evelyn's smile faltered. What letters? The ones between you and Professor Callahan. I met her gaze squarely. The ones where you promised to get him tenure if he failed me in his class. Where you outlined exactly how to make it look like I'd slept with him for grades. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. Evelyn's face went pale. You're lying, she whispered. I shook my head. I took them to father that night. Showed him everything. The memory rose, sharp as broken glass. He said he'd handle it. Said I should pack a bag and go stay with Aunt Marjorie for a few days while he dealt with you. My voice broke. Instead, he called the dean, had the whole thing swept under the rug. And when I got back, my bags were packed. And he told me if I ever wanted to be treated like an adult, I needed to make my own way in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began its morning song. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. And you just left, without telling me. Without what was I supposed to do? The words tore from my throat. My own father chose Evelyn over me. Again. I was 18 years old and suddenly realized no one in this godforsaken house had ever loved me. So yes, I left. And yes, I was a coward about it. Evelyn stood abruptly, her composure cracking. This is ridiculous. Those letters never existed. You're making up stories too. They're in my father's safe, I interrupted, along with the original copy of the will and the paternity test results proving you're not his daughter. The color drained from Evelyn's face. For a moment, I thought she might actually faint. Then, with a sound that was almost a growl, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward the house. Daniel and I stood frozen in her wake, the morning sun now fully cresting the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. All these years, you thought I knew? I swallowed hard. I thought everyone knew, that they all believed Evelyn's version. He reached for me then, his callous hands framing my face with surprising gentleness. I would have believed you, he whispered, if you'd given me the chance. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. 12 years of loneliness, of telling myself I didn't need anyone, came crashing down around me in that moment. My hands found his wrists, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. I'm sorry, I breathed. Daniel rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closing briefly. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in their green depths. What now? The question hung between us, heavy with possibilities. I thought of the will, of the 6 months I needed to stay, of Evelyn's barely concealed fury. The game had changed, but the players were the same. Now, I said, stepping back reluctantly, I think it's time I opened that safe. The study felt different in the morning light. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows, illuminating the worn leather chairs and the imposing mahogany desk that had been my father's domain. I stood before the portrait. Above the fireplace, that stern, unyielding image of Charles Hart that had watched over every childhood punishment, every humiliating lecture, and wondered if he'd known this moment would come. Daniel's presence at my back was both comfort and complication. His familiar woodsy scent mixed with the study's aroma of old books and pipe tobacco, creating a disorienting blend of past and present. I could feel the heat of him just inches away, the solid reality of the man contradicting all the ghostly memories that haunted this room. The safe is behind the portrait? He asked, his voice low. I nodded, reaching up to grasp the gilded frame. Always thought it was dramatic of him, like something out of a bad mystery novel. The portrait swung away easily on hidden hinges, revealing the steel safe embedded in the wall. The sight of it sent an unexpected tremor through my hands. 12 years. 12 years since I'd stood in this exact spot, watching my father tuck away the evidence of Evelyn's scheming like it was nothing more than a mildly embarrassing family secret. Daniel's hand brushed my shoulder. You know the combination? Birthdays, I said bitterly, crouching before the safe. His and Evelyn's. The irony wasn't lost on me. The perfect daughter's special day, immortalized as the key to all our family secrets. The dial turned smoothly under my fingers. 10:29, October 29th, Evelyn's birthday. Then for 17, my father's. A soft click echoed through the silent study as the lock disengaged. The safe door opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. Inside, neatly arranged as only my father would have kept them, were several stacks of documents, a small velvet box, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. My fingers closed around the letters first. The paper crackled with age as I untied the ribbon, revealing Professor Callahan's distinctive handwriting on the topmost page. Even after all these years, the sight of those words, Evelyn's cold calculations laid bare in black and white, made my stomach churn. She really did it, Daniel murmured, reading over my shoulder. His breath was warm against my neck. Planned the whole thing. I shuffled through the pages, each one another nail in the coffin of my childhood. She must have been furious when she realized I took them. She probably tore the house apart looking for them. A folded piece of paper slipped from the stack, fluttering to the floor. Daniel bent to retrieve it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. Lillian. I took the paper from him, my heart stuttering as I recognized my father's handwriting different from the formal will. This was the rushed scrawl he used for personal notes. Lillian, if you're reading this, you found the truth about Evelyn and Callahan. I handled it poorly when you first came to me. The truth is, I didn't know how to protect you without exposing our family to scandal. But I've made arrangements that will change everything. Stay the 6 months, claim what's yours, and know that whatever you choose to do with the truth about Evelyn, I've left you the means to do it. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. The date at the bottom caught my eye just 2 weeks before his death. He'd known he was dying, known I'd come back, known it would all come to this. A sound at the study door made us both turn. Mrs. Peabody stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide as they took in the open safe, the papers in my hands. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with surprising speed for a woman her age, she stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her. I wondered when you'd find those, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He had me put them there after the last time. Daniel tensed beside me. The last time? Mrs. Peabody's gaze flicked to me, something like pity in her eyes. The night Miss Lillian left. Mr. Hart was in a right state after she was gone. Drank half a bottle of whiskey and locked himself in here for hours. When he came out, he made me witness the new will. She hesitated, and he told me the truth about Miss Evelyn. The air left my lungs in a rush. He told you, but not me? The housekeeper's wrinkled hands twisted in her apron. He was ashamed, miss. Ashamed he'd let it go on so long. Ashamed of the way he'd treated you. Her voice dropped further, and afraid of what Miss Evelyn might do if she knew he knew. Daniel made a low sound in his throat. You're saying he was afraid of her? Mrs. Peabody didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached into the safe and withdrew the small velvet box I'd noticed earlier. He left this for you too, she said, pressing it into my hands. Told me to make sure you got it when the time was right. The box was heavier than it looked. I flipped the lid open to reveal an ornate key resting on crimson velvet, the kind of old-fashioned skeleton key that might open a medieval dungeon. Beneath it lay a folded slip of paper with a single address written in my father's hand, 47 Blackwood Lane. What is this? I asked, lifting the key. Mrs. Peabody's lips pressed into a thin line. Best you see for yourself, miss. It's not my place to say. She turned to go, pausing at the door. But if I were you, I'd go soon, before Miss Evelyn realizes what you've found. The moment the door closed behind her, Daniel and I exchanged glances. Blackwood Lane, he said. That's the old cottage by the North Woods, isn't it? A chill ran down my spine. The cottage had been abandoned for years, ever since old Mr. Blackwood died when I was a child. We'd dared each other to go near it as teenagers, spinning ghost stories about the reclusive old man who'd lived there. Why would my father want me to go there? I murmured, more to myself than to Daniel. He took the key from my hand, turning it over in his fingers. Only one way to find out. We moved quickly after that. I returned the letters to the safe, no need to let Evelyn know we'd found them, but pocketed the note and the key. Daniel insisted on coming with me, though we agreed it would be safer to go separately to avoid raising suspicion. I was just closing the safe when the study door flew open with enough force to slam against the wall. Evelyn stood framed in the doorway, her face flushed, her breathing ragged. Her eyes darted from me to the still open safe to Daniel standing entirely too close. What are you doing? she demanded, her voice shrill. I schooled my features into careful neutrality as I swung the portrait back into place, just showing Daniel where father kept his good whiskey. For old time's sake, Evelyn's gaze narrowed. She stepped further into the room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood. You're lying. Her attention shifted to Daniel, her lip curling. And you? I'd have thought you'd learned your lesson about sniffing around where you don't belong. Daniel didn't flinch. Just paying my respects to Mr. Hart's memory, Miss Evelyn. The honorific was pointed, a reminder of the distance between them. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides, her manicured nails digging into her palms. I could practically see the calculations going on behind her cold blue eyes. What did we know? What had we found? Get out, she said finally, the words dripping. Venom. Both of you? I didn't argue. Brushing past her, I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume, something floral with an underlying note of bitterness. Just like her, I thought as Daniel and I made our escape into the hall. We didn't speak until we were safely outside, the morning sun now high enough to burn away the last of the mist. Daniel kept pace beside me as we walked toward the garage, his shoulder occasionally brushing mine. She knows something's up, he muttered. I nodded, my fingers closing around the key in my pocket. Which means we don't have much time. The garage held my father's old Range Rover, dust-covered but still functional. The keys hung on their customary peg, another small rebellion, taking the car without permission. As I slid behind the wheel, Daniel hesitated. Maybe I should follow on my bike, he said. Less noticeable. I shook my head. We're past subtlety. Get in. The engine roared to life with surprising ease for a vehicle that hadn't been driven in months. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Evelyn watching from an upstairs window, her face a pale smudge against the dark glass. Blackwood Lane was less a road than an overgrown track leading deep into the woods north of the estate. The Range Rover jolted over ruts and exposed roots, branches scraping against the sides like skeletal fingers. The further we went, the denser the forest became, until the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy overhead. There, Daniel said suddenly. Pointing through the windshield, the cottage emerged from the trees like something from a fairy tale, the wrong kind. Vines crawled up its stone walls, and several roof tiles were missing, but the structure stood solid despite years of neglect. The windows were boarded up, the front porch sagging in the middle. I parked a short distance away, killing the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant call of a crow. You sure about this? Daniel asked as we approached the cottage. No, I admitted, but I was already fitting the key into the rusted lock. The door opened with a groan of protest, revealing a darkness that smelled of damp and disuse. I fumbled for the light switch, half expecting nothing to happen, but surprisingly, a single bare bulb flickered to life overhead. The interior was not what I expected. Where the outside spoke of abandonment, the inside had been meticulously maintained. The floors were swept clean, the furniture, what little there was, free of dust. And against the far wall, "Is that a safe?" Daniel asked, echoing my thoughts. It was larger than the one in my father's study. A hulking metal beath photograph trembled in my hands as I stared at the woman's face, my face, or near enough. The same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn set to the jaw, even the way she held herself, one hip slightly cocked as she smiled at the camera, was eerily familiar. Daniel's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Lillian, you okay?" I couldn't answer. My fingers found the other documents in the box, a birth certificate for Lillian Grace Hart, listing Charles as father and Eleanor Marie Westbrook as mother. Hospital records from a private clinic in Switzerland. And beneath it all, a death certificate dated 3 days after my birth. Eleanor Marie Westbrook, 23 years old, cause of death, complications from childbirth. The room tilted around me. Daniel's arm came around my waist, steadying me as my knees threatened to give way. "Breathe," he murmured, his lips close to my ear. "Just breathe." But how could I? How could I when everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie? Margaret Hart, the woman I'd called mother my entire life, had never been my mother at all. And my father, all those years of coldness, of distance. Had he looked at me and seen the woman he'd loved and lost? I sank onto the cottage's dusty, sofa, the documents spread across my lap like some grotesque parody of a family album. Daniel crouched before me, his hands warm on my knees. "We don't have to do this now," he said gently. "We can take this stuff back to the house." No, the word came out sharper than I intended. I need to know everything. Now. The other boxes yielded more secrets. Bank accounts in my name, established when I was a child and quietly growing ever since. Property deeds, not just a cottage, but a Manhattan apartment and a villa in the south of France. And a letter, the paper brittle with age, addressed to me in my father's handwriting, with trembling fingers. I broke the seal. "My dearest Lillian, if you're reading this, I am gone, and you have discovered the truth I should have told you long ago. Eleanor was the love of my life. We met when I was in London on business. She was an art student, full of fire and passion unlike anyone I'd ever known. Margaret and I were already estranged, though we kept up appearances for the sake of the family name. When Eleanor told me she was pregnant, I promised to leave Margaret and marry her. But Eleanor refused. She didn't want to be the reason for a scandal, didn't want our child to grow up under that shadow. We agreed she would have the baby in secret, and I would raise you as my legitimate child with Margaret. But things went wrong during the birth. By the time I arrived in Switzerland, Eleanor was gone, and you were alone in the world. Margaret agreed to pretend you were hers for a price. She never let me forget that she'd saved you from disgrace. And she never let me forget that every time I looked at you, I saw Eleanor. I failed you, Lillian. I let Margaret treat you as less than Evelyn because I was weak. I saw how Evelyn tormented you and did nothing because I was a coward. But everything in this safe is yours, not just the money and property, but the truth about who you really are. Your mother was brilliant and fierce and uncompromising. And though you never knew her, you're more like her than you can imagine." The letter slipped from my fingers as hot tears spilled down my cheeks. All those years feeling like an outsider in my own family, and I had been one all along. The unwanted cuckoo in Margaret Hart's nest. Daniel gathered me into his arms as the sobs racked my body. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort, just held me as I fell apart, his strong hands stroking my hair. When the storm of grief had passed, I pulled back, wiping my face with the heels of my hands. "I need to see her," Daniel frowned. Your real mother?" I nodded, already gathering the documents. "There's an address in Switzerland on the hospital records. If that's where she's buried." A sound from outside froze us both, the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a car door. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, crossing to the window with silent steps. "Evelyn," he hissed. "And she's not alone." I hurried to his side, peering through a gap in the boarded-up window. Evelyn stood beside a black town car, deep in conversation with a hulking man in a dark suit, one of my father's former security detail, if I wasn't mistaken. Even from this distance, I could see the fury in every line of her body. "She must have followed us," I whispered. Daniel's hand found mine, squeezing tight. "Back door." Now. We moved quickly, silently. I grabbed the most important documents, the letter, the photograph, the DNA results, shoving them into my jacket as Daniel relocked the safe. The back door opened with barely a creak, revealing a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. We'd barely made it 10 yards when Evelyn's voice rang out from the cottage. "Lillian, I know you're here." My pulse pounded in my ears as we crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our arms and faces. Behind us, footsteps more than one set gave chase. "The river," Daniel gasped, pulling me along. "If we can reach the bridge." The woods grew denser, the ground sloping sharply downward. Somewhere ahead, I could hear the rush of water, the same river where Daniel and I had spent so many summer afternoons as teenagers. The memory gave me a fresh burst of speed. We burst through the tree line onto the rocky bank, the old footbridge just visible upstream. But as we scrambled toward it, 2 more figures emerged from the trees on the opposite bank, cutting off our escape. Evelyn's laughter rang out behind us. "Running away again, Lillian?" "Something's never changed." I turned to face her, my back to the rushing water. Evelyn stood flanked by 3 security guards, her blonde hair perfectly smooth despite our chase, her designer clothes untouched by the forest. The contrast between us couldn't have been starker, me with my torn jacket and wild hair, her the picture of icy control. You always did overplay your hand, Evelyn, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Bringing muscle to a family dispute? Really? Her smile was all teeth. Oh, this stopped being just a family dispute the moment you broke into that safe. She held out her hand. Give me what you took. Daniel stepped slightly in front of me, his body tense. Back off, Evelyn. One of the guards moved forward, but Evelyn waved him back. How touching. The groundskeeper's son playing knight in shining armor. Her gaze shifted back to me. Last chance, Lillian. Hand it over. I thought fast. The documents in my jacket were the only proof of who I really was, the only leverage against Evelyn's claims. But surrounded as we were, with the river at our backs, then I saw the old boathouse just downstream, its roof sagging but still standing. Daniel followed my gaze and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Fine, I said, reaching into my jacket. Take it. But instead of the documents, my fingers closed around the velvet box from the safe. With one swift motion, I hurled it into the rushing water upstream. Evelyn's shriek of rage was almost satisfying. Get that, she ordered the guards. Now, as they scrambled after the floating box, Daniel and I made our move, diving into the icy water and letting the current carry us toward the boathouse. The shock of the cold stole my breath, but I kicked hard, fighting the pull of the water. We washed up against the boathouse's rotting pilings, hauling ourselves onto the precarious deck just as Evelyn's screams echoed from upstream. The documents in my jacket were soaked but intact for now. Daniel pulled me to my feet, his hands shaking from cold or adrenaline or both. We need to get out of here, I nodded, wringing water from my hair. The old logging road, it comes out near the train station. We moved as quickly as our sodden clothes would allow, keeping to the tree line as Evelyn's shouts grew fainter behind us. The documents felt like a lead weight in my jacket, the truth they contained even heavier, because now I understood why my father had left me everything. Not just out of guilt or remorse, but because I was the only true heir he'd ever had. Evelyn wasn't just spiteful and cruel, she was a living reminder of his greatest humiliation, just as I'd been a reminder of his greatest love. And if the look in Evelyn's eyes had been any indication, she knew it too. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold that felt at odds with the turmoil inside me. Daniel's arm stayed firmly around my shoulders as we collapsed onto a bench, both of us shaking from cold and exhaustion. We need to get you dry, he murmured, rubbing warmth back into my arms. His touch was gentle, but his eyes kept darting to the road leading from the estate. They'll come looking once Evelyn realizes we didn't drown. I clutched the soggy documents to my chest. The ink had run on some of the pages, but the important parts were still legible: the birth certificate, the DNA results, my father's letter. The photograph of Eleanor was ruined beyond recognition, her face blurred into a watercolor smear that made my throat tighten. I need to get to Switzerland, I said suddenly. Before Evelyn can, Daniel's grip tightened. Hey, one thing at a time. He fished his phone from his pocket, grimacing at the water that poured out. First, we need a safe place to regroup. Somewhere Evelyn wouldn't think to look. The answer came to me instantly. The cabin, my father's hunting lodge in the Berkshires, a place Evelyn had always hated for its lack of modern amenities. There's a spare key hidden in the boathouse, Daniel nodded, already scanning the empty road for passing cars. We'll need wheels and dry clothes. His eyes met mine, green and steady. And we need to decide what we're going to do about all this. I knew what he wasn't saying. The documents in my hands changed everything, not just about my past, but about the will, the inheritance, Evelyn's entire existence. With proof that I was my father's only biological child, Evelyn's claim to the Hart name and fortune evaporated. The distant rumble of an approaching engine sent us both scrambling behind the station house. A rusted pickup truck rolled into view, its bed filled with gardening supplies. Daniel recognized the driver before I did: old Mr. Henderson, who'd owned the nursery outside town since before we were born. Stay here, Daniel whispered, and before I could protest, he was jogging toward the truck, waving his arms. I watched through a gap in the boards as Daniel leaned into the driver's window, his posture relaxed and easy. After a moment, he pulled out his wallet. Soggy bills changed hands, and then he was beckoning me over. "Mr. Henderson's giving us a ride to the bus station in Millerton," Daniel said as I climbed into the truck's cramped cab. The older man tipped his hat at me, his eyes curious but kind. "Good to see you again, Miss Hart," he said, putting the truck in gear. "Heard about your father." "Fine man." The lump in my throat made it hard to respond. My father had been many things, but fine wasn't the word I would have chosen. Still, I managed a nod as we pulled onto the road, putting distance between us and Hart House. The bus ride to the Berkshires passed in a blur of damp clothes and whispered plans. Daniel managed to buy us dry sweatshirts and jeans at a roadside convenience store, and by the time we reached a trailhead leading to the cabin, the morning sun had warmed us enough to stop shivering. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, a rustic two-room structure nestled in a clearing of pine trees. The boathouse key was right where it had always been, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, and the air smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. Daniel built a fire while I spread the documents to dry on the kitchen table. The silence between us was comfortable, familiar in a way that made my chest ache. How many summers had we spent here as teenagers, stealing weekends away from our responsibilities? "You realize what this means," Daniel said finally, nodding to the birth certificate. "With proof your Charles's only biological child, Evelyn has no claim to anything," I finished. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but all I felt was tired. "But that's not why I want these documents." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Then why?" "Because I deserve to know who I am." My fingers traced the blurred edges of the ruined photograph. All my life, I felt like an outsider in my own family. Now I know why. The fire crackled in the hearth as Daniel studied me. "What are you going to do?" I thought of Evelyn's rage at the cottage, the lengths she'd already gone to in order to protect her secrets. This wasn't just about money or property anymore, it was about identity, about legacy. And Evelyn would fight dirty to preserve hers. "I'm going to Switzerland," I said, "to see where Eleanor is buried." I don't know. Feel some connection to her, I guess." I met Daniel's gaze. "And then I'm going back to Hart House to end this. Once and for all." Daniel didn't try to talk me out of it. He simply nodded and reached for my hand. "Then I'm coming with you." The simplicity of his declaration ended me. After everything, the years apart, the secrets, the betrayals, he was still here, still choosing me. The documents took 2 days to dry completely. We spent the time planning, calling in favors, and when the nightmares woke me screaming, holding each other in the narrow bunk beds we'd once shared as teenagers. By the time we boarded the plane to Geneva, I had a new birth certificate from a discreet contact of Daniel's, the DNA results safely digitized in multiple locations, and a steely resolve in my gut. The private clinic where Eleanor had died was now a luxury hotel, but the cemetery down the road still stood, its wrought iron gates bearing the same crest they had 30 years ago. The caretaker, an elderly man with kind eyes and limited English, helped us find her grave after I showed him the death certificate. It was a simple stone, partially obscured by ivy. "Eleanor Marie Westbrook," it read. "Beloved daughter, 1968 to 1991. No mention of me. No indication that she'd ever been loved by Charles Hart or birthed his child." I knelt in the damp grass, my fingers tracing the cold letters. All the things I wanted to say, the questions, the anger, the longing clogged my throat until I couldn't speak. Daniel stood a respectful distance away, giving me this moment with the mother I'd never known. When the tears came, they were quiet. Not just for Eleanor, but for the little girl I'd been, the one who'd grown up believing she was unlovable, unwanted. The truth was so much more complicated. "We should go," Daniel said softly when the sun began to dip below the horizon. "Our flight leaves and I want to see the house," I interrupted. "The one my father bought her." The address and the documents led us to a modest villa on Lake Geneva's shores, its pale stone facade glowing in the late afternoon light. A young family lived there now. We could hear children laughing in the garden, but I stood at the gate for a long time, imagining Eleanor walking these same paths, dreaming of the life she might have had. It was dark by the time we returned to our hotel. I expected to feel drained, but instead, a strange calm had settled over me. The pieces of my fractured past finally fit together, and the picture they formed was bittersweet but clear. Ready to go home? Daniel asked as we packed our bags. I thought of Hart House, of Evelyn's scheming, of the legal battle that awaited us. But I also thought of the safe full of documents, of the properties and accounts that were rightfully mine, of the power I now held to shape my own future. Yes, I said, I'm ready. The scene at Hart House when we returned could have been lifted from a Gothic novel. Evelyn stood in the grand foyer, her face pale with fury, as our lawyers, mine newly retained, hers long established, argued over the validity of the DNA results. Margaret sat stiffly in a wheelchair by the stairs, her once beautiful face slack on one side from her stroke, but her eyes sharp with malice. You have no proof. Evelyn spat as I entered. Those documents could have been forged enough. My voice cut through the chaos like a knife. For the first time in my life, I held everyone's complete attention. We all know the truth now. I'm Charles Hart's only child, which means everything, this house, the businesses, the family name, belongs to me. Margaret made a strangled noise, but it was Evelyn who stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. You'll never prove it in court. I don't have to. I reached into my bag and produced a single sheet of paper. This is a signed affidavit from the doctor who delivered me in Switzerland. There are copies with my lawyers, with the courts, and in several safety deposit boxes. Fight me if you want, Evelyn, but you'll lose. And you'll do it very publicly. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the lawyers stopped shuffling papers. Evelyn's face went through a series of contortions: rage, fear, calculation, before settling into something almost like resignation. What do you want? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd thought about this moment constantly since Switzerland. About revenge, about justice, about making them pay for every cruel word, every slight, every moment of loneliness. But looking at Evelyn now, at the fear in her eyes, at the way her perfect facade had finally cracked, I realized I didn't want their misery. I want you gone, I said simply. You have 1 month to remove your things from Hart House. I'm giving you the Hamptons property and the trust fund my father set up for you. That's more than you deserve, but it's what he would have wanted. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed like a fish. And mother? I looked at Margaret then, really looked at her. The woman who'd resented me from the moment I came into her home, who'd allowed Evelyn to torment me, who'd spent my entire life making me feel like an intruder. There was no forgiveness in my heart for her, but there was no hate left either. There's a suite at the Pembroke, I said, fully staffed, with round-the-clock nursing care. She'll be comfortable there.